This week we're focusing on prostitution. Remember that in this course we'll be looking at social history, so this is part of the reason why we look at prostitution, to see the way American society kind of impacted women's lives, and not that every woman was a prostitute, but it is an important group to address because of the things that they face, both as prostitutes but also as women too. I think in one of the previous lectures I indicated that America was founded by prostitutes, right? They brought them over in boats during the colonial period so they could marry some of these people off. Well, we're going to continue that conversation by looking at women in the kind of 1830s period, particularly focusing on the murder of Helen Jewell. You had an article that mentions her over and over, even though the article focuses more in general terms in regards to prostitution in New York. Her murder is quite significant because it's all over the news for somebody that, again, for prostitutes, they're not really considered that significant in American history, yet here we have a woman that was all over the press in the 1830s. We're going to address the impact that she had in American history. So when we look at the history of prostitution, we see, as I said earlier, right, prostitution is as American as apple pie, right? A few studies that I have kind of focus on major cities, but I'm sure we can look at any community and we could find prostitution there, even in our own backyard. You could go to Scottsdale and, some of these mansions are brothels essentially, right? Because they always get caught. If you watch the news enough, you'll see some of this information out there. Any major community has, these type of industries in it. So yes, these things are as American as apple pie. Now this study, actually it's a few studies that I look at, focuses on New York. New York is a very important city. And we find that, prostitution is essentially everywhere, right? It's in the poor areas, it's in the rich areas, it's in the middle class areas. When it comes to the history of prostitution, a lot of times we find that they're quite common next to universities where, it's very male dominated. So yes, they're going to be there, right? You're going to have red light districts there. In places like New York, there's a study that focuses on the economic impact of prostitution in New York. We find that in New York, there's a person who kind of owns the land, a person that develops the land, and a person that leases parts of that building, right? And when it comes to prostitution, it was almost a for sure way to make money. So this is part of the reason why we see it flourish in places like New York, because that you're going to make money off it, not only for the person that's running the business, but those who control these buildings too. You're better off leasing to a brothel than you are to a legitimate business, because more than likely there's going to be a higher return and more long-term leases for brothel owners at this time. At the same time, we really don't see much of a police force. Yes, they exist, but their concern isn't really these type of crimes, if you will. Their concern was mostly associated with, big business. If somebody was hurting industry in some shape or form, such as strikes or looting or something like that, then they would get involved. But these type of crimes, nobody seemed to really care, at least not the police force, so they weren't a very big deal during this period. And where was prostitution in New York? Well, we could find it in places like the Five Points. If you know much of New York history, Five Points, very notorious neighborhood. That's where most of the immigrants kind of came through and lived, and kind of poor people lived. So yes, you're going to find prostitution there. But you're going to find them in the better places, in the west side of New York, where the Astors lived. The Astors were a very important family in New York, where Columbia University is located today, right? King's College at that time, where all the elite live. So a modern equivalent would be Scottsdale. Other places, kind of more working class hangouts, right? The Water and Cherry District tend to have high volume of prostitutes. And by the ports, there's a place called the Hook, where all these laborers kind of hung out, waiting for jobs. Very kind of working class area, industrious area, and you're going to see prostitution there. So a lot of people had economic interests associated with prostitution. You know, the brother of a founding father, John Livingston, had economic interests in some of these industries. So again, a lot of them kind of leased the land of buildings that he controlled. So you have these people kind of dependent on prostitution in order to make a living. And we see prostitution in many ways in our culture. It does become part of pop culture. Women during this period, not that they're looking up to prostitutes, not that they want to be prostitutes, but you know, some of these prostitutes are in the latest fashions, or you know, have the latest makeup and clothing and things like that. So you know, we often emulate them. I mean, today we look at our Hollywood stars and we try to emulate them, such as, you know, maybe the Kardashians, or I don't know too much about Hollywood anymore, but you know, we try to replicate the way they look. So these women kind of represented that ideal for many women. And as I really noted that in New York, 1 in every 7 person was a prostitute, right? That's a lot. You know, in our class, there's 32 of us, and 1 in 32 of us, or sorry, 3 out of 32 would have been prostitutes had we been alive in the 1830s. We find that during this period, the age of consent was actually 10 years old, which obviously to us, it's obviously, you know, very, very wrong. But at that time, women could actually maximize their profit because most of the women didn't get their periods till a little bit later. Today, I think, you know, women develop a little bit sooner. So back then, it's a little bit later. So this allows them to engage in this type of act without the worrying about, you know, getting pregnant, at least for a short period of time. We find that for virgins, and this is quite common, where they have these balls and they will auction off virgins. You kind of see that in one of the readings, right? The one in New Orleans. I think it's the first story, where a woman is auctioned off for, you know, a ridiculous amount of money, only because she's a virgin. So $5, I mean, that's a lot of money during the 1830s. And then the reading talks about how not only is land being leased by brothels, right, but also different industries are dependent on prostitution, such as the theater, where they have certain sections allocated to prostitutes so they can engage in their business. This drums up business for them, right? So it makes sense for them to set a space that's safe for prostitutes to engage in some of their business deals. I think the article does a really kind of good job indicating how New York was built on prostitution. You know, they were needed to bring, you know, investors into the city, and they were part of that transaction. And we see people again emulating them. There's a section in New York called the Bowery District. It's still there today. It doesn't look anywhere like it did back then, but the Bowery District had a lot of bars, and, you know, a lot of women kind of hung out with men. But the Bowery gal basically followed the fashion of the prostitutes. Understand that during this period, it's a very kind of virgin whore dichotomy society, right? Either you're the good woman or you're the bad woman. Obviously, prostitutes will be put in a bad woman category. However, these Bowery gals were kind of blurring that line of the virgin whore dichotomy by kind of dressing in the fashion of prostitutes, but not being prostitutes. So again, we kind of see this today too, where women kind of emulate this kind of fashion, but doesn't make them prostitutes. So it definitely, I don't want to say it's empowering, but it does, as a historian, kind of look at it at these moments that kind of challenge the status quo of respectability when it comes to women's identity. Though, again, we're not trying to say that this is a good life or that anybody should go into this industry, because it was a very hard life, right? Even though we talk about America being founded on this kind of Puritan ideal, we find that people engage in sexual identity, right? So there really are no very limited sexual restrictions in this early American period. When it comes to the law, prostitution wasn't illegal in the 1830s. What was illegal was a disorderly person law that they had in books in New York. So you can be a prostitute, but if you were seen as unemployed, then you were considered a vagrant. So this can get you put in jail. But if you had a job and were a prostitute at the same time, it wasn't considered a crime. Even in the reading that you read at the end, where these men attack these prostitutes, we find that for the most part, the cops were more concerned with the destruction of property than the industry that these women were involved in. And a lot of times when it came to prostitution in this era, it's men who were perceived to be the victims of prostitutes. So women are the ones who are targeting men. At least that's the way it's perceived by a very patriarchal society. I think that happens all the way up to the 1960s, maybe even 70s, where eventually they start going after, police start going after the men, because they're the ones who are the consumers of this industry, right? But throughout history, it's men were, poor men, right? They're the ones who are being coerced by these women of the night. We find that prostitutes, they have rights, as I noted earlier, right, with the example from the reading. Prostitutes took men to court. And we do see how prostitutes were useful in many of the aspects of New York society. Ward bosses used prostitutes as a way to coerce the local community to vote in a particular way. So prostitutes were an American institution by this period, very much so necessary for the city to function. The life of a prostitute, it wasn't a great life, you can only imagine, right? Different classes of prostitutes. Obviously, drugs were a major pandemic amongst this community. Opium being the drug of choice, and most of these are derivative of opium. But it's a very hard life, and these women try to find a way to escape, this life, because it was a very, dangerous life. So drugs allowed a way to escape this emotion and psychological strain in their daily lives, right? So many of them suffer from depression, and it's not something to glamorize. I'm sure these women had other options; they would have, gone that route. But we find that when it comes to different types of jobs during this era, they were limited, and obviously didn't pay enough for them to survive. Now, I want to shift over and talk about the murder of Helen Jewell. It's a very interesting murder. Helen Jewell comes from a background that is not typical of a prostitute. She's actually well educated. Her real name is actually Dorcas. And she lives with a family called the Westons. And there's no proof of this, but one historian, a professor that I had at UCSB, kind of makes this point that it's possible that she might have been molested by Mr. Weston. which kind of leads this life into prostitution. However, while she was while she was living with these people, she learned the mannerisms of this upper class society. And this is what kind of sets her apart from other prostitutes. She eventually grows up and moves over to New York. And for a while, she's a kept mistress. So basically somebody's just giving her money so she can survive. Very beautiful woman, again, very educated woman. And this is what attracts many people to her. We find that she never had too many customers. She only had a handful. And she charged about $3 to $5 per customer, which, again, earlier I noted that a virgin would go for $5, which was a lot of money. Here she's charging that much per customer, so she's doing well for herself. She also invested in herself, right? Prostitutes, the reason why they wear certain clothing is because it makes them more attractive to different customers. So she wore some of the most finest silks, and some of the finest, ribbons and bows, and got all dressed up. And this was a sign that she was part of that kind of upper class of prostitutes during this era. And one customer that she had was Richard Robinson. Richard, she had many customers, but she used to write a lot of letters to these men that she kept. And one in particular was Richard, and actually found the letters. I have the book that kind of talks about some of this literature. And it's very kind of interesting because when it comes to prostitution, a lot of times we see it as a sexual transaction. And we find that wasn't the case with Helen. With Helen, it was more of almost like a romantic relationship where it almost has these tones of love. If you read some of these letters, and I normally read them in class when I teach this material, it's a very emotional relationship. So when it comes to prostitution, a lot of times we think that men go to prostitutes just to have sex with them, but sometimes they're a little bit deeper where they don't even have sex with them. It's just you're buying their time because they're listening, right? They're interested in you because you're paying them, but nevertheless they show that sign of interest. So that's what this relationship kind of delves into. She talks about it as in a way that she truly loves Richard. And there's an example where Richard actually goes to a different prostitute. He goes to the same brothel where she's located, but he ends up going to a different prostitute. And she writes him a letter where she's just devastated. She cannot believe that he would cheat on her, quote unquote, right? And it's funny because she's taking another man, yet she feels like Richard cheated on her. So Helen Jewell ends up getting murdered, and it's part of that whole event where when he goes to a different prostitute, where Helen is jealous, and supposedly what happens is that they have a fight by the staircase at that brothel, and he has a hatchet, and he just grabs a hatchet and just hits her in the head with it, and just kind of destroys her skull. So this murder, again, it's just a prostitute. Prostitutes die all the time, but this one stood out because of the way she is presented in the press. It begins in the penny press. The penny press are just cheap literature that anybody can afford. It's really produced for the masses, and eventually the story kind of catches on. I'm trying to think of a modern equivalent. That Arias woman here in Arizona, the one who killed, I think he was a Mormon guy, and she killed him in the bathroom and all that, and it got all this press, right? At the beginning, nobody really cared until some lady on TV kept on talking about it. What was her name? Nancy something, I can't remember. But she kept on talking about it, and all of a sudden it just kind of blew up, and every day, that Arias woman was on TV, right? Her case was on TV. Also just because it shocked the community that a woman, so small could commit such a crime. Well, this kind of takes the same road, where at the beginning nobody really cares, just a prostitute, one of many that die. But as people catch wind of this story, they begin to write more and more and more. So much so that these newspapers, who were once part of these kind of mass literature, become very important newspapers, at least during that era. And they talk about Helen Jewell in a way that's, again, very positive, where it's like, wow, this prostitute, wasn't just a sex object, but she, very selective in the customers that she took in, and also provided this romantic illusion to all her customers, which is really what puzzled everybody, that people were not just paying her for sex, but rather to engage in some kind of relationship with her. So as I mentioned earlier, right, Helen Jewell was supposedly jealous when Robinson left her. And it went to trial. The case actually went to trial, but there was enough evidence to convict Robinson of this murder. So he was let go, and at the end he ends up moving to Texas, or different parts of the United States. He ends up in Texas. And as he's dying, this black woman, I think it was one of his slaves, was taking care of him. And supposedly, this black woman heard, as on his deathbed, heard him ranting about what he had done to Helen Jewell. So, kind of like making a bedside confession, but nobody would ever know if this was the actual truth. And then he just dies, and the story eventually kind of just disappears until his story not too long ago wrote about it. So the case itself is just very intriguing, because it showcases prostitution in a whole different light, partly because she wasn't working class or desperate for money or anything like that. She was a middle class woman who took very few customers and provided a service that many of them could not get somewhere else, or at least didn't want to get somewhere else. Right? She provided this idea of love without the commitment. But then it does kind of develop into something bigger than that, as we see Helen Jewell was actually jealous of Robinson's infidelity, if you will. So we find that prostitution in New York, and you could say this about any other part of the United States, was very much so part of our economic system. When we talk about who built the West, a lot of times we say the cowboy built the West. Well, no, it was actually prostitutes who built the West, along with a few other people who built the West, right? So prostitution, again, it's a very much so important part of not only New York's economic system, but the United States economic system throughout our history. It's not a life of glamour. It's a very hard life, and I provided a few points. Even back then, people were doing drugs, and understandably so, when they're engaging in this industry. And lastly, we address this very infamous murder, but also a murder that kind of shapes pop culture. The more the press started talking about this, the more interest people got, and the more they try to emulate it. So definitely begins to shape our social fabric during this era. Okay, so we'll stop it there, and hope you all have a good day.